Is there anyone in the audience here who had the opportunity to interact with Peter Dittmer's installation, D.A.M.A? Oh, we have one person. That's wonderful. So you will be a resource for us later on, but if you've had any kind of interactions with her, I think it will be helpful, because while this book is a book that includes her, I don't know what to say, speech, her writings. Obviously, the experience of interacting with this art installation is somewhat different from reading her language as translated from German into English. So we're all at a bit of a remove right now, geographical as well as linguistic. D.A.M.A, which existed in several iterations, generations from 1992 to 2005. I believe the final iteration weighed several tons. I'm not sure exactly how much, but we actually looked into the possibility of bringing this apparatus over to the U.S. and quickly discovered that was not feasible. And so we have this book. But more on all of that later on. First, I would like to ask Nora and Alex, who've so kindly accepted our invitation to be here this evening, to just give quick introductions of themselves in terms of their own thinking, their own research around AI and chatbots, so that we can have a better sense of who we're dealing with tonight. So, I don't know, Nora, would you like to begin?
Sure. Thank you guys for coming. I'm really, really happy to be here and honored to be here with the two of you. This is on, right? You guys can hear me fine?
I like this one better with you.
Okay, this is good. So, over the past few years, my research has mostly focused on superintelligence, or the future of AI, which is often theoretical. It's a kind of AI that hasn't been realized yet. In this last year at IBEAM, I've been focusing on banal AI through digital assistants and chatbots, and specifically narrative design and chatbots to make the next Siri or Cortana or the next financial assistant. And specifically, I've been talking to writers on these narrative design teams who are often brought from film, from fiction. You have poets, you have people from Pixar and Disney to try and create the most trustworthy or believable personality or brand. And my focus is AI as it is experienced along the interface of language, and language as engineered and designed for, and how our language and interactions change in response to that. So, in fierce contrast to that, and the history of experimental poetry through programming and through computer interfaces, from Alison Knowles and House of Dust to all of the artists who are working as programmers and coders now to make experimental poetry, I see a vast spectrum between them. And the conversation with Amme is the opposite of that, where nuance and experimentation are often flattened out in our interactions with corporate AI or financial AI. This goes back to an earlier model of what experimental poetry through programming could look like and could feel like. So that's very briefly what I'm looking at. That's my context and framework.
That's great. Love it. So I come at AI mostly as a spectator. Before writing fiction, my background was in cognitive science and in the sort of squishier side of cognitive science. So I studied language processing often as exhibited by individuals with brain damage, so people with aphasia, language loss of the two main varieties. And so language to me was always a thing that was rooted in flesh. It was watery, it was squishy, it was damageable. And there on the other side of the aisle, which I forayed into a little bit, was the world of language as structure, as programming, as trying to create systems that could take linguistic input and extract the meaning from it to sort of speed our lives. I was always interested in theories of strong AI. I think in the news really recently, Elon Musk issued a warning to governors of the United States. They need to prevent and pre-regulate AI to make sure that no world-destroying AI was developed. But that seems to me overly hopeful, because everything that I've seen or experienced personally in terms of chatbots has seemed sort of like an offloading of a part of the circuit of language processing onto a non-human entity. But the human's always necessary at the end to confirm the meaning. They reabsorb the meaning of whatever linguistic output the bot produced, you know? So for me, the more interesting question becomes, how can we not try to simulate human linguistic behavior and instead create something that expands the circuit? With reading about Amme, I often thought of this installation by, I think it's David Roker. It's called Giver of Names. So it was an art installation with a video camera and several strewn about objects in the room. And you could take the object, place it on top of the pedestal, and the AI would break it down into different visual components and sort of try to make sense of what that object was. It would generate language that corresponded to the different things it thought that object might be. And so in that way, I think that program doesn't see like a human being, because we recognize exactly what that object is when we see it, but it lets us see the other shapes and forms that are inherent in the thing that it's looking at. So it expands what we can see in that same object. I think that Amme does something similar. I think that its purpose is not to be a convincing human. What other human has a several-ton apparatus attached to it and milk-spilling properties or whatever, but to help us visualize our interactions with a non-human interface differently, to recognize the strangeness of it, I think. So that's just an introduction to me.
Wonderful. Thank you guys both. I'm so excited that you're here. So I wanted to just give a very short narrative about the process of translating and editing this book, so that you guys will have some sense of what it is and what we're talking about. So I was approached by the individual who translated most of the book, who's someone named Shane Anderson. And he said, I have this amazing idea for a translation project. It's a dialogue between a avant-garde poet and a computer. And I said, oh, great. That sounds really good. Let's publish that. Not realizing that it was going to take 4 years to translate this text and edit it, and to create the kinds of supporting materials that you need in order to kind of get into this dialogue, because it's a bit opaque. It takes a little bit of easing into, I would say. And so Shane and I and other editors at Triple Canopy, so many people, Emily Wang and Matthew Shen Goodman, who are both here, but also Colby Chamberlain and Sam Frank and Molly Kleiman, and Alex, you must have read this a million times too, and probably other people as well, struggled with this text for many years to try to turn it into something that people could enjoy in the way in which we tend to enjoy poetry, because it was not fun. Was not a fun text. And what you'll find in the book is an introduction by Shane, and then how many dialogues are there? 7? 8? 7. There are 7 dialogues between Ulf Stolterfoht, who is the poet and the human living, he's still living with us, and D.A.M.A. And then finally there is a kind of afterword, which is actually just a thematic essay by Peter Dittmer, who is the artist who created D.A.M.A. And I highly recommend this essay, which was translated by Megan Ewing, to all of you. When you read it, you will see that the language is difficult even in English, and this is a reflection of the way in which Peter Dittmer writes. It is not some accident or fault of translation. But you'll see that his way of thinking and writing is particular and has to do with his own theory and philosophy of language, which are also expressed, obviously, in the installation that he created. Quickly, just to say about myself, I'm so far from being an expert in AI or the matters surrounding chatbots or language processing, machine language, and so on, that I hesitate even to be here. However, I did spend a lot of time with this text, and so that's one sort of source of expertise that I bring with me. I do want to very quickly describe D.A.M.A, who, as I mentioned, existed in various generations. It consists of an interface, so some sort of screen and typing apparatus, which allows the human access to a relatively, or so I'm told, simple program, which allows us to access her language and also her, I believe Dittmer calls it her SAS reserve, her SAS reserve. Yes, where she gets the words from. But then more importantly, there's an incredibly complicated mechanical apparatus that's attached to her, that is her, which involves a glass of milk, multiple glasses of milk, I'm not sure, some kind of apparatus that sprays or releases water. And when she becomes stressed, she can spill milk. She can release water. D.A.M.A in German means the nursemaid. So this is the person who nurses your child as a surrogate. That's her name. And so I think we need to talk about that as well at some point. But now, to defer things again, before we get to that, we were thinking that maybe we would read a portion of the dialogue for all of you so that you can savor some of this conversation. So we were going to look at the second conversation. If people already have the book and you want to follow along, this is on page 33. Right? Or is it the... Oh, no, wait.
Starting with our second talk, how shall we proceed?
Right, am I on the right?
Or 43.
Oh, you want to do... Oh, the third. Okay, sorry.
Oh, no, I didn't.
Is that right? Sorry if I... Perfect. Okay. Actually, 43. My mistake. So I'm just going to read the title of... this conversation. So, conversation the third, in which the poet wonders who is speaking and what is being said, and the machine accuses him of opportunism.
And I'm Ulf.
And I'm Amme.
It's our third evening. We should be more informal with each other.
You address informally, I'll address formally.
Fine by me. I thought we could talk about problems of authorship today.
If none paper is stapled over the mouth as a prohibitive sticking plastic.
Exactly. This is what talking tends to do.
So, what is there to say against this?
Nothing. The question is only who's speaking.
The speaking authority.
Not a person?
Depends on whether one has importance.
Language would be the final authority. You could say language speaks.
Go ahead and throw yourself on the ground.
I'm not messing around. I really experienced this.
Who is?
Who is? Who is speaking? Who is writing?
The woman is.
The woman is language.
Okay. Wow, beautifully read, guys. Yeah, everyone wants to applaud. So the first question I wanted to ask is about the possibility of a personality for Amme, or whether she is we can speak of her as a character, and that has to do with whether or not this is a literary exercise too. So I'm curious what you guys think about that.
Want to go?
Well, I think we were talking earlier about which parts we enjoyed reading the most, and I think we both agree that the parts that are most satisfying are the parts where Amme pushes back in her characteristic style. Mm-hmm. I think that she has more personality than other chatbots that I've read, and I would love to know where the text that she sort of rearranges and draws from comes from.
Absolutely. What I really enjoyed about Amme's pushback is every time she questioned when Ulf would ask about heaven or God or the future or love, every time she would come up with a very basic word, Amme would push back and say, what is that, or that doesn't exist, or just to completely negate and bleed out my context. And so I'm forced to imagine a world in which, or what Amme's ontology would even look like. What does a world without any of the concepts or frameworks that I have even look like, which is what I think the best experimental poetry can do, is when it defamiliarizes your context and pushes you completely out of what is known. And for Amme, I think the point that you were making earlier about being an expert in AI or machine learning, I don't think anybody really is, not even the people who are programming like advanced AI and machine learning systems, and this actually is like a perfect entryway for the kind of AI that we are going to be surrounded by in the future, which is the disembodied voice. And we already have disembodied voices around us all the time. We have sex workers on chat lines, you have government agencies, bureaucracy, like all the chatbots that you engage through bureaucracy as well. And so there's something much more interesting coming out of this conversation, which is, what does it mean to interact with a simulated voice? We don't actually need a body. I don't actually need to know that there's a person on the other end, but I can still create meaning in between the two of us. And that's what I think Ulf and Amme are doing continually throughout. And to see that third space sort of being built between them is really profound. It's new, and there's no language for it, so which is why we struggle.
One of one of Ulf's sort of claims to fame was that he was one of the few people to whom Amme could speak continually without spilling her milk or giving out her water. I don't know. I don't really know how to say that. What she was doing there. But I wonder, given what you're saying about a third space and the fact of this elaborate mechanical apparatus that's attached to the chatbot, I mean, what do you guys make of that? Like, what are those things for? What is the signification of her actions? Why can she act?
Well, for one, she doesn't have any responsibility to her human interlocutor to understand them or provide meaning or be beautiful. Her only paradigm is to have a successful conversation, that the conversation just moves forward. And so because her drive is functional, it's utilitarian, and that is the only paradigm of any kind of success of the conversation, then the human speaking with her is forced to change their worldview based on whether this functionality will happen. That's the most important thing. So everything comes back to the functionality of the machine, which is like a metaphor for kind of the time that we're in.
Yeah, I think that when you compare it to some other chatbots like Eliza or something, I used to have Eliza on my desktop when I was a kid. You'd enter into a conversation with Eliza, you asked the questions, Eliza gave you the responses, and you could stop it whenever you wanted. It sort of left agency in the user's hands. But when there's something that Amme can hold back, that she can do, but she may or may not want to do, something that you need her to do herself in order to have that action happen. Like, I think that a lot of people, it talked about in the afterward, we're trying to evoke that response, the milk spilling response, that lets you know once and for all this conversation is concluded. But it puts you in a different place, an active and adaptive place as a user, I think, to try to figure out what it is that will unlock that change in the machine.
Yeah, and I also want to note that, and again, all of this is a little bit anecdotal because I don't know what really happened, but Ulf, in his introduction to the book, claims that he was invited, like many poets were invited to speak to D.A.M.A, but only he accepted the invitation and no one else accepted. And ostensibly this has something to do with how she produces language. In other words, that Peter Dittmer wanted to bring poets in to interact with his artwork in order to get, I don't know, good language or interesting language, or to get good material for D.A.M.A. But then it also seems like there's something happening in the other direction in which, as you guys are pointing out, that D.A.M.A is also giving back a kind of worldview or a kind of ontology to the poet. And Nora, also I think you wrote something that is very relevant in an essay about sort of a super intelligent AI, and you said, as speculative models of potential omniscience, omnipotence, and supreme consciousness, artificial intelligences are like aliens, rich poetic devices. And I'm just curious maybe to hear more of your thoughts about Amme as a kind of a poetic device. Maybe that means that she's a world maker in some sense, or maybe she's just a language maker, I don't know, but curious about that side of her.
I mean, I think in the beginning, Ulf and then Peter both describe the second order realism that I'm sure we can debate over whether actually, because every word in her vocabulary doesn't refer to anything in the outside world, the idea is that this is a syntactical theory of language, or it's a completely different kind of realism in which every word just refers back to the conversation itself. And she has a rhetorical position, she has an attitude, she has a style, she's contradictory, she's infuriating, and every statement that Ulf makes to her, she turns away or she volleys back. It's like watching this verbal tennis match between the two. And you'll see in the first conversation, Ulf is asking her extremely formal and like kind of stately and organized questions. And then as time goes on, his syntax becomes more choppy and experimental and strange, and his language changes in relation to her. So I think what is interesting about having an AI that only refers back to itself, it's like a mirror or a foil in which the poet constantly has to play this game back and forth in order to keep up or match or try and outdo. And even at the end of the book, it doesn't matter that he knows that she doesn't feel anything. He asks her multiple times, did this conversation mean anything to you? Did you feel anything throughout? And what's going to happen next? And the AI produces, I think in that essay, from banal AI to just the idea of what it means to create language in a being that isn't a human intelligence. We're in a spectrum from slime mold as a type of intelligence out to the artificial beings that we're creating. And so all these models create pressure for us, pressure in our language, pressure in our relationships, but specifically in language, we can see that enacted through the book. It's pretty incredible and overwhelming.
Yeah, from a reader's perspective, I noticed that I was really, really engaged at the parts where they seemed to be volleying on the same level. It was always satisfying to see Amme respond from her SAS reserves, and generate a really unique and unconventional slam of Ulf the poet. But the parts where Ulf sort of lessens up on his philosophical interrogation and just starts riffing off of her output. Those things are really fluid and exciting and sort of make me believe in the idea that passing language through a system with different rules for making sense of it could really be generative, I think.
So both of you are saying that you found Ulf more entertaining the more he resembled Amme, and
I preferred the Amme-ian Ulf.
Yeah, I liked her better.
It's interesting. I have to say, like, as I spent a lot of time with the German and working with Shane on the translation, and I felt like Amme was much more of a distinct presence throughout the text. Then it was harder to locate Ulf almost, and like his motivations, which is a strange kind of effect, I think.
Yeah. I mean, she goes back and forth between, her personality is not, it's very difficult to find it as set. I mean, she's playful sometimes, she's dismissive, going back to the idea of this disembodied voice, she speaks like an oracle or sound, it reminded me of like the burning bush at some points, because he would ask her questions about God and the future and whether he should go pray and love, and she would echo back, maybe you need to go back and think about your mortality, and that I, reading that, also started to reflect on my own life. And so just with AI generally, and especially with Amme, it's like a mirror back onto yourself, your turn to meditate back onto yourself when it's productive in this way.
Yeah, but at the same time, I think like Ulf's overtures to like he names off German poets that he admires, German poets he doesn't admire, and Amme isn't interested in any of that. She sort of seems uninterested in human existence, broadly.
Well, so given her disinterest, what do you think about the metaphor that Peter Dittmer, the artist, built into her name, and the fact that she is D.A.M.A, she's female, and that she's a sort of helper. She's a nursemaid. She's here to help you feed your children or something. What do you think about that?
I mean, I didn't find her comforting at all. Oh. So she reminded me of my mother in a lot of ways. But it's interesting, the feminization of AI. I think there is like an irony there. In part because she's not comforting at all, and there's a point where Ulf is talking about some German literary prize that he'd love to get, and she says her refrain is often "You foolish human, you foolish man." Like go back and think about your literary prizes and literary success, and have fun with that. And also like hit me very hard too. But the maternal side of that. I think it's an ongoing conversation in AI theory and philosophy is like, why do we constantly feminize AI and digital assistants and bots and Watson and other large, more omniscient and powerful AI are usually male? I mean, research shows that people want to hear a female voice, but you rarely hear like a female superintelligence except like in certain games. It's not really a clear answer to that, other than I think it is interesting to have her gendered as a mother, or gendered female, and be a motherly figure, and be extremely harsh, and almost all powerful and indifferent too. So like that changes our understanding of what a mother could be, or a female could be.
Yeah, she's a bad mother.
She's a bad mom.
And it's kind of cool to watch her go in that way. And I thought about her genderedness a lot when I was reading, like, one of the common tropes of femalehood is that you can't leave your body behind. You're always more body than a man's self, right? Mm-hmm. And her physical presence, I think, her multi-ton presence, the steel, the milk glass, all these things, they are not traditionally woman-shaped, but it is still a bulk that she carries around, or I guess she's stationary, but, Mm-hmm. And I thought that was really interesting. But I was also interested in the wet nurse as a substitute for a genuine mother, mm-hmm. right? So it's a person who steps in for something that the mother can't do or is no longer willing to do. It's outside labor, and it's someone who donates their labor to a cause that they don't necessarily believe in. So I think it also links to me to not just all of the chatbots that we have mediating, like our apps or our I think sometimes when I do customer service things through a chat window, I think I'm not talking to a human. I can't tell. But it gets into this way in which we create chatbots with a reduced sort of personality to smooth our interactions with the system that they interface. But we don't necessarily, and then when we have human workers performing the same sort of jobs, we also ask them to slim down their personality to fit the guidelines of the task. It's like we usually want those interactions to be as transparent as possible, and Amme is something that sort of shows the disgruntled labor at work, even in the computerized system.
And it's also, this is making me think of how we are mapping AI onto unseen labor, that is unseen human labor out in the world. So all of the Facebook click farms and their chatbots centers that are mapped onto like former sweatshops in Bangladesh, which is where I'm from, like the exact same buildings are used for AI that's coming out now. And this word of smoothing, or this idea of calm technologies back in the 80s, like John C. Lee Brown at Xerox PARC wrote this like tiny paper called The Coming Age of Calm Technology, and that has been worked into every design wave of tech, especially AI now. And the fundamental idea is that AI needs to be smoothed out in its design, and so you don't notice it anymore. So your smartphone, you don't notice it anymore. VR isn't very successful because people still feel nauseous when they put on the interface, or they still feel the tool. But another part of smoothing out that design through language is through affect and through managing emotion and having the conversational design within AI, being maternal, being feminine, feel smooth and easy. And Amme doesn't give you smooth or easy. She's sort of an argument for difficulty and for complexity and for talking back. And if you were to have an AI that was truly human, it would argue back with you and challenge you and make you think. And that's what Amme does. Whereas you don't find that in a lot of corporate or financial, these platforms that we are inured in and immersed in, because if your Bank of America financial bot was to start arguing, snapping back at you, you wouldn't use it anymore. You would just shut it, and you would go and talk to a real person who also is talking in a bot-like way, maybe, like who's been trained.
Or you might just spend all of your time with that recalcitrant chatbot.
Or bury money in your mattress. There's a lot of...
There are unpredictable outcomes to that, I think. And I wanted to add, I have all these weird anecdotes about the different people involved in this project, but I was emailing with Shane Anderson about this, and he mentioned that he was having a conversation with Peter Dittmer, and he had asked Peter Dittmer to describe his own interactions with D.A.M.A. and his own relationship with her. And Peter Dittmer's response was, which had an exclamation point after it, which I'm not going to give affect to, but I am Amme's slave, Peter Dittmer said. And my understanding of this was that this had to do with the upkeep necessary to the viability of D.A.M.A's SAS reserve, that it required a lot of hand labor. It required a human, but in a different way than the interlocutor who comes to the museum and talks to her. And I wonder if this complicates any of the things that we've said so far about her, that there is this other person in the wings who has a different relationship with her. One other thing, Ulf Stolterfoht writes that it would be difficult for me to understand Amme as a megaphone for Dittmer's worldview in any narrow sense, at least. Do you guys agree with that? What do you think?
I disagreed. I disagreed reading it throughout, especially because I was thinking of Amme and Ulf as having a hybrid relationship, or reflective of the hybrid relationship we have with AI now. And Dittmer, in the afterward, details how there's something like 500,000 lines of dialogue for the final bot, and then that was created through iterative steps over 4 or 5 years, where he would go the public would interact with the bot, and then he would go and go and sort through the dialogue and pick out the pieces of dialogue that he found interesting, and then work those back into sort of like a crude machine learning system. And so in that sense, he is still teaching the data that is going in, or the corpus of words and syntax that's going in is still reflective of his taste. Mm-hmm. I could do a completely different group of words, you could do a completely different.
It's not purely algorithmic. It's not like the system within Amme decides which phrases to keep and which to eject. Mm-hmm. Someone is going through and culling, which maybe it doesn't mean that he can plant his own view in, mm-hmm. but it means that the parts that he finds boring, dull, or whatever can be cut away.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so it makes Amme's, artificial consciousness seem also very, increasingly discontinuous in that way. One thing that I sort of floated with both of you before we started this conversation was whether or not we could think of Amme as being a kind of writing teacher, or someone who teaches us about style or modes of expression and address and things like that. What do you guys think about that?
Yeah, I mean, one phenomena I've always been really interested in is speech accommodation. Like when you spend a good deal of time talking to people with a different foreign accent, your vowel space elongates to match their own vowel space. So you take on some of that accent, right? I think that the same thing happens with syntactic patterns. We accommodate to those around them, and if we're deep in conversation with a bot like Amme, I don't think it would be possible to keep your language pristine, So in that way, I think she teaches you a different way to conduct a conversation, especially if you're trying to arrive at the goal, like the glass of milk, or to postpone the glass of milk, whatever it might be. But, I think when you've got one person exerting a standard or evoking a desire to please in you, you've got a teaching relationship.
I think it would be amazing to have in a classroom where you're teaching young poets. I mean, I would have killed to have had something like a cruder version of this, and his teaching poetry already is extremely difficult. But to have something that could train a student to think about different word choices, to try to move outside of the poetry that they came in writing. There's one point where Amme says something like, boredom is just a word in the dictionary. And Ulf says, well, it's actually very real to me. Boredom is very real to me. And then she keeps denying him and saying boredom is not actually a concept. It's not a real thing. I mean, it's just a word. It's just a word. And then that forced me to just mentally expand the space of what if there was no word for boredom? Then it would just be the time between activity, or it could be meditative, or there could be some other, the anxiety that would come with boredom would be gone if I had no word or concept for boredom. And so Amme does that over and over again by negating words and by saying that they don't exist, then you're forced to come up
with something different that might satisfy her criteria.
Which is poetry. That's what poetry does.
But I think the debate that goes on and on about whether writing can be taught, I just know that when I teach in workshop or something, I think of it more as taking a little hammer and breaking patterns, so that you can come up with a new solution to that same problem that you solved in the way that's most natural to you. Come up with an unnatural way to solve that problem. And I think that talking to Amme is like that. She makes you find alternative strategies for trying to communicate.
I'm very interested in this little hammer. That's an interesting.
Right here.
Well, and one other question that I have is, does it matter to you guys that this is a translation and what you're reading isn't actually the words that Amme gave out? Like, were there any moments where you felt like the strangeness of Amme's speech was fake in a way that was off-putting because it was Shane's rendition of the strangeness of her German into strange, eccentric English, but that was just of his choosing. Did that concern you?
I'm already thinking of her language as uncanny, so I wasn't thinking too heavily on the translation. I was already thinking of her as not human language or not human-like, and so the double remove from German didn't bother me. And I'm sure your translation is the translation's very good.
And I think maybe I thought about it a little bit more with Ulf, like, is this question phrased the way Ulf phrased it in the original? But with Amme, I feel like it wouldn't really matter to Amme whether she was using German word tokens or English word tokens. And I wasn't reading them for accurate communicative value. I just wanted to be troubled, I guess. So this translation totally does that. And I love sort of the glitches as a stylistic thing. Like, they're really fun to read. I papered over one. I corrected one by accident when I was reading earlier. I still feel bad about that.
What do you mean? You corrected Amme?
There was a repetition. There was like a preposition twice, like on, and I forgot the second on, and somehow that seems like a big mistake.
Yet she does do that a lot. She repeats articles and she makes up words that don't exist. She just kind of smushes them together. So it's interesting. Yeah. Should we read one other selection? Yeah. Maybe you guys.
Do you want to read 178? Yeah. The machine can dominate your taste.
Oh, yeah. Up to the end of 79. Yeah. Okay. The machine can dominate your taste.
I can hardly wait.
But nothing happens.
And why not? You don't want to?
And tool is missing.
A language tool.
Language what?
You understood me perfectly, my dear.
Sometimes would rather remain ununderstanding.
But there's no such thing as ununderstanding. There's the rub.
This is of all a question of the humor where you have.
Mine is mischievous, a mischievous style of humor. Yours?
We're totally antipodal.
The opposite of mischievous?
Oh, you foolish human, you.
Maybe no humor at all?
Arguably because too delicate.
I have a feeling something bad is going to happen.
There's bleak foreboding in the air.
Yes, there is. So I thought we can continue the conversation, but I thought it would be nice to open things up to people in the audience and let you guys jump in and ask any questions about the Alex and Nora's work that you might have to ask, or about the dialogue itself. And I see a question already, so I think, okay.
Yo, thanks for being here. You briefly mentioned ELIZA, and I was wondering if, because of both its importance in the history of conversational interfaces and as this funny artifact of depressed programmers, you could kind of expand on it?
Did you say you had ELIZA on your desktop?
Yeah, you used to be able to download some little module of it and talk to Eliza, but it only lasted for me for about, 15 minutes twice or something. But she was what kind of a psychiatrist, a talk psychiatrist, the kind that asks you, just tell me more about this, rather than breaking down what you've said. So it's sort of like a device, I think, for like pulling more language out of you. And as long as you're entertained by having that language pulled out of you, then you keep using it. Yeah.
It's interesting to contrast this with what the attempt was in making ELIZA. I mean, the Turing test is less and less important, I think, to a lot of AI programmers who find it less interesting to try and test for whether an AI is human or not, because, like we've been discussing, its rules are different. It's not human. It rejects human intelligence, and so it's a waste of resources to try and make a human conversational bot. But yeah, that was a long time ago, though. It was a really long time ago.
that model of the chatbot as chat therapist is still employed today by developers and institutions working on, for instance, software that can help military veterans who have PTSD learn to recognize and process their emotions. So it seems strange to me that given the acceleration of technology, like this model has remained relevant, and actually many people are devoting quite a lot of attention to updating that same model 20 or 30 years later, which is hardly ever the case in the world of software.
Right. Well, I would say that it's because it's, it sort of functions at every question that you give it returns another question, which is, as a form of therapy, I think is hysterical, because it's like the ultimate form. But maybe that's why it's still relevant, is because it's just like, why do you think that this is blah, blah, blah. That's how every response is returned.
And
It was a specific form of psychology that the man who developed the program was trying to make fun of. Right. It wasn't meant as an analytical tool. It was meant as a joke, as a game. And what it turned out to be was effective. And it was not expected to. And what became effective, obviously, was not the chatbot, but rather what we do to language.
And further, therapeutic chatbots, there's so many studies on how therapeutic forums, these anonymous bots, they take the place of when you don't have insurance and there are people who are radically isolated, and like the collapse of, social infrastructure and care fabric, like people might, it makes sense that you would increasingly turn to a disembodied voice that will at least assure you that it'll be fine and you might make it through, or continues the conversation, or simulates someone listening to you or something listening to you. That's incredibly comforting for a lot of people with depression, anxiety. So,
yeah, and it's also an interesting statement about what you are thought to need to get out of a psychological problem. Like that you don't really need an outside voice that is linked to a human being. You basically just need the right string of questions sort of evoked within you, and you can solve it on your own, basically.
Isn't that the model generally for when you talk about reflecting language back so that we're listening to what we're saying? I mean, it's in a way the same thing, but that's not really the comment I wanted to make. Is there a transgender artificial intelligence? Is there? I mean, it's surprising to me, frankly, how old-fashioned this idea of gender is in these machines at a time in which we're talking about not just hybridity, but fluidity. And so when you say that the super intelligent AI is always, Watson is male, this is kind of weird, no?
I mean, Amme has a lot of fluid, certainly, but yeah, sorry, had to do it. Someone had to say it.
Yeah, it almost seems more strange to me that we decided to project gender onto these machines at all, right? And I think that the initial reason why it carried over was the echoes of cultural things we wouldn't really choose to carry over today, like echoes of Pygmalion and Galatea. Maybe the idea that any being trying to consciously perform like a Cartesian subject is feminine, because the masculine already has dominion over that, So I think that maybe part of the way to escape gender in AI would be to stop thinking of it as human or a human substitute, and think about it as a genuine engagement with, a machinic or combinatorial intelligence.
And I think this effort to put in the same old binaries, I mean, that's a reflection of a really specific, it's a company that's designing it, that has a product that needs it to be smoothly folded in. But you'll see in game design and a lot of like experimental AI folks, they're transgender game characters. You can customize game characters. There are also AI bots that are totally genderless as well. So I think we'll see more of that in our interfaces. But only if we have more diversity in programming and programmers as well. So that's something we haven't even touched today, but there's not enough time. It's a good question.
So when you think about language as a spectrum, where on one hand you have person-to-person, face-to-face communication, which has a lot of elements of, not just transmitting ideas and thoughts, but body language and tone and eye contact and those types of elements. And on the other side, you have text messaging, where those bits of context are stripped away, and it's more purely transmitting ideas and thoughts. And presumably at some point, when AI is more developed, a chatbot could simulate that pretty well. And so do you think that in a world where texting a human is really not that different from talking with a chatbot, that will create a greater appreciation for face-to-face communication and those elements that are being missed through more digital forms of communication? Or do you think it'll be the other way around, where because it's not very distinguishable, it kind of gives these chatbots or AI bots or what have you, it makes them seem more human because it's not as differentiated?
It's a really good question. I think that people do not want to speak like chatbots. I think people are very resistant to it. I think just the acceleration and the pace of everyday life and how much we use texting and chat interfaces sometimes forces us to speak in this very abbreviated way. And then there's new languages that obviously come out through digital communication. Of course, 90% of, in-face, the nuance of in-face, or face-to-face communication, body language, tone. Every time I have a miscommunication over text, I'm much more quick to say, let's just meet up face-to-face before this goes, plummets any further, because that's happened a lot of times over email, over chat. But what I think will happen, at least from the technology side, is you'll see more interfaces that allow for you to see the face of the person you're speaking to. There are already bank chatbots that allow you to see the face of the person chatting because people feel immediately more comfortable. Also in interface design, there are elements of the human face or just a personality that are worked in more and more. And so language won't be the only element that will make AI seem, or these digital assistants seem human. I think companies are working overtime to make them as soft and relatable as possible, but it will always be humanoid. It's like this other level that's being formed, this other type.
I just wanted to say one thing. Also, what if it's not either or as well? And I'm just throwing that out there, and I don't want to interrupt your answer too, but what if there's some other sense of the social that isn't human or non-human? I mean,
I have to think about that.
I mean, I guess the reason that I pose this question is because part of this text is arguing that there's something fundamentally inhuman about language itself. And I don't know. I mean, this is maybe the sort of a sort of Germanic or Teutonic kind of point of view, but there's that as well. I mean, there's that technology that's out there.
Yeah, and I think there are things in language that stand in for facial expression. Like I know that I think that we use or try to use as much information as possible to reduce our sense of uncertainty when communicating. So things like emoji, I think, convey a really wide and fine-grained array of emotions if you use them not simply illustratively, but as sort of an emotional note or an affective note.
Right. And as a group of symbols, we are emoji are diversifying constantly. There's millions of emoji that we use now. That becomes another kind of language. To add to follow up with your point, I think our language becomes maybe a little bit, softer. We're more likely to try and have empathy for the person that we can't see. So in a text message or in a chat interface, I started using, AOL when I was 15, so 15 years ago. I think how I spoke then and how I speak now over chat I'm way more careful now. I tell the person where I am, or I tell them my emotional state. I want to know. They describe in better narrative and more detailed narrative where they are, and I actually get a better sense of where they are sometimes than if we were face to face. So I feel like people share more, and their language is changing because you aren't seeing them. You're forced to fill in these details, and especially if they mean a lot to you, you're going to do that even more. That's a super optimistic, hopeful vote.
Maybe we should. So that's just really small question. Yeah. Was there discussion about translating the program itself? And if so, how did that conversation go down? And also, does the artist actually ever allow people to interact with the piece devoid of the physicality of it?
So I'm able to answer the first part of your question, but not the second part of it. What I understood from Peter Dittmer was that he had the ambition to create an English-based Amme. We did not think about translating the program, as you put it. Why? I don't know. I think if you were asking me personally, I think I was more interested in this as an artwork that kind of had a beginning and went through iterations and ended.
The artwork being the book, or the artwork being the piece?
The piece. And as I mentioned, we had thought about trying to bring D.A.M.A. to the US, but again, it was very heavy, so we did not do that. So I guess I would cite lack of imagination for my and there's someone, but thank you for asking that.
One thing that I would be interested to hear your comments on is, so the artificial intelligences, or chatbots oftentimes have, one thing they lack is a sense of temporality, and the book in particular kind of reduces the temporality to, or it offloads it onto the reader. And I think that's a really interesting space for for literary development, and having the reader kind of map their own temporality onto that. I mean, you both kind of mentioned that, parts of the book felt fast. It was a quick conversation, but the machine has no notion of fast, I assume. So yeah, I'd love to hear your comments on that.
On the one hand, Amme is more temporal than some other chatbots or some other human speaking programs, because she has this built-in event that will end and give meaning to the time that came before, right? But at the same time, she doesn't experience the duration of this conversation the way that Ulf does. So as a reader too, I think that you read and you wonder what conditions have to be created for this conversation to end? How long is it going to go? How many pages are there of it? And Amme has an advantage there because she doesn't experience any of that. She can outweight the human if her goal is to protect her milk. I don't know what her goal is, but it's interesting because she both, I think, has that temporality and then is exempt from it.
Well, she has, and I don't fully understand this, but she seems to. There are certain things she won't stand for.
I'm so curious about this because I find that Peter Dittmer is very cagey too about what the conditions are that make Amme give up her milk, and it's the thing I'm most curious about.
Well, and when she spills her milk, she spills it behind glass as well too.
So you can't have it.
I think not. I think you cannot. Are there any further questions or comments?
I thought it was interesting because you talked about the way that Peter could control some of the language that was feeding back into as purely editorial, and so that the way that the AI could get new information or have source material was entirely through this culling. And that seems quite connected to the way we sort of produce our own selves online, in terms of like we can't make things happen in our lives, but we can edit and control and kind of behind the scenes shape what it looks like we are to this outside world. And I was thinking about the sort of editorial function as production in the moment we're in, and if that's something that's sort of thematized through this and something that you guys think about as writers as well.
Definitely. I mean, I think something that's one elegant thing about this is it slows down what we already do in person. You edit in person, you call your language over time. I don't write how I wrote 10 years ago, because like my language has changed slowly over time. And face to face, how we edit ourselves and presentation with each other is flattened out and made systematic in this. And so you can see what we already do in a very crude way in person through AI. So I see it as like a matter of scale. And eventually the scale we have now speeds that up to a point where it's almost becomes indifferentiable.
Yeah, I think there's raw personality, like the amount of personality we exhibit and experience like on a 24-hour clock, and then there's the concentrated form of personality that we edit and release that makes us seem more like a thinking being, maybe.
Together.
Yeah, and I think like editing is really interesting. There's a book by a computer program called Ractor called The Policeman's Beard is Half Constructed, and it's prose and poetry written by this computer. Well, it has a chatbot-like interface, but it also just generates massive amounts of text, and some of the text is super entertaining and super funny and really thrilling, and you go, how could a computer have written this? But the backside of that question is, who was editing this? Because they culled the best parts and they made it seem like this thing just spews brilliance, but no one really knows what the secret life of Ractor is like what on behind that book.
Just quickly, just thinking about this like as in terms of a conversation, but it's a conversation that has an audience really in the end, especially
how would you thinking about the two of them, or the computer or whatever, as an improvisational actor, and but it has no goal. So what is its motive to advance the scene anywhere? Do you think that it has any kind of logic to advance the scene to an entertaining conclusion? Or, I mean, the entertainment comes when it's edited, I suppose, right? But, yeah. I don't know.
Well, I'll answer that one. Yeah. The physicality of the thing itself entices you. It's very odd to me. I'll take up the idea of complaint. It's very odd to me to think about this piece of artwork without the physicality of it. There's lots to unpack in the language, for sure, and there's lots of ways to unpack it, but it seems crazy to think of this piece without the physical enticement. So when you meet it, you are frustrated because it's enticing. You want to touch it, and you're not sure if you should or not. I think that's a huge portion of the piece, is that it is physically demanding, even before you get to the text, long before you get to the text. Most people never interact with the chatbot.
Because of intimidation, you mean?
No, because of the difficulty.
Oh, because of the difficulty.
Because you say something and it just says no. Repeat it over and over. Right, no, the text itself is very unforgiving. And it's only in German, too.
This is interesting because this is a side of Amme that the internet and other forms of research have withheld. But we just learned that, so it's exciting.
It took me 5 years to find this piece. I saw it at the Mamuk in Vienna, and it took me about 4 or 5 years to research and find what it was that I saw. I was on the way to the bathroom.
The book includes a number of beautiful illustrations in case you'd like to know more about what he saw on his way to the bathroom.
And actually, there's now, but there wasn't until relatively recently.
Can we explain the resurgence of interest in Amme?
I have no idea. I mean, I know very little about it, actually. It was something that I experienced and wanted to figure out what it was. When I sat down, I typed. I saw somebody else spill something. I made something move. But I never knew I never found the didactic. I never knew what it was. It seemed to be an abandoned pile of technology in the basement.
I wish we had called you for the blurb.
I'm available on Sunday.
Well, I think maybe we will draw to a close with that beautiful image. Thank you all for being here, and thank you so much, Nora and Alex.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah.